clearest prospect of happiness and prosperity that ever was presented to man. That's quite a statement. So what is it about our form of government that makes it so durable? Why is it that today the American Constitution is the longest existing form of government in history? Today, we are the oldest nation under the same Constitution than anyone in the world. In fact, the Constitution was ratified in 1789, and today is 2026. See, 26 plus 11, 37. We've had 237 years. We're the oldest nation on the globe. Why is that we have that long-standing government? Well, we see that there are 7, you can't see them too well in that picture, but there are 7 pillars that support a constitutional form of government. And we see that below that, there are 7 slabs or foundation stones that support the 7 pillars, okay? So let's take a look at that individually. Here's a better schematic, and you can see the republic is at the top, and then we have these 7 pillars. The Constitution, which makes us a constitutional republic. We're decentralized. We don't have all of the power in Washington. No, it's divided up between the states. We're decentralized. Separation of powers, jury trial. We have a civil military. That's very important that the civil government rules over the military. Okay? The military is not independent, ruled over by a general. No, it's the president is the commander-in-chief, and the president is elected. So we have a civil control on the military. Jurisdictions, which are areas of influence. The states have certain influence. The local governments have certain influence. The county governments have certain influence. And the national government has certain influence. And then we also have representatives that the people vote. So these are 7 pillars. Now looking at that's the form. As you see, the form, the external thing that you see is you see that we have a constitution. These are things you can read and see and view and see them operate. But what's supporting that? That's the power. That would be the internal power that's supporting the Constitution. We have self-government, is that top stone. We have a union, or the idea of having a covenant. We form a union of states. We have individuality, the respect and honor of the individual. While we still are forming a union, yet the individual matters, and we value that. We recognize private property. Private property is very, very important. And your own conscience, which is your property. Your conscience belongs to you. And, you know, we don't probably teach enough on the conscience, but that's a precious property that we each have. Education is very important. There's a sowing of seeds and ideas into the youth, and there's a reaping, and that's our education system is. How well it does is how well it sows, how well it is going to accomplish the design and the purpose. And then we have Christian character. You know, if we didn't have Christian character in our culture, we wouldn't have honest citizens. We wouldn't have people who would, you know, who would show regard to their neighbor. Love your neighbor as what? Thyself, right? On these 2 commands hang all the law and the prophets, Jesus taught. Okay? Love God and love your neighbor. So see, even though your neighbor might be, you know, do some foolish things, you still need to love them, right? And so the Christians doing that, see, that's the cement that holds the culture together. You probably didn't know that, did you, when you're showing love to your neighbor, that you're being part of that, you're showing that. A lot of you are doing that, I'm sure. And then finally, the very bottom stone, faith in God and His Word. Now, why is that such an important thing? Because that is the oldest book in the world. 66 books of the Bible all together. We have 39 books in the Old Testament, 27 in the New Testament. And there we see God's law, we see the Ten Commandments, we see God's working among men, we see the gospel, how we can come into a relationship with God. That is the most important book in history. And it's one of the oldest books that we could ever read. I mean, some of those books go back centuries before Christ. So you're looking back 3,500 years when you read your Bible. You've got the book of Job, you're looking at about 4,000 years when you read the book of Job. You're reading something that was way before Plato, way before Aristotle, way before, who's the famous guy who wrote the Odyssey? The Iliad? Homer. Way before Homer. These are ancient books, and it's God's Word. It teaches us His way, teaches us His purposes in man. So we have a teaching in the summer, which we do each year, and this is a good place to plug this teaching, just in case you are interested in that. It is also on your pink sheet, on the very bottom of the pink sheet. We learn these 7 principles. We go over them so that once you learn them, you can teach them on to your students, or you can present them to your Sunday school class, or to your adult Bible study, whatever that forum might be. So anyway, some information, July 28th to July 31, we have that class in Albuquerque. Now, Washington displayed both the power, y'all remember the power? The power is the lower part. It's the internal part, Christian character, individuality, those things that are unseen, that are really part of the way God has made us. And then the form is the external part, the part that we see, that we can recognize in the American Christian Constitutional Federal Republic. He recognized this. Let's look at individuality. Let's see what he said about individuality. He was a man of providence. He believed that God was at work, God's providence, His care, His superintendence over His whole creation. That's what providence is. And that God is at work in His life. And he actually recognized that and actually wrote about it. And so let's take a look as he goes into the French and Indian War in 1755. He was born in 1732, so he is 23 years old, and he goes into battle, and he's under the command of General Braddock, Edward Braddock. He's a British officer, and the Americans and the British are fighting the French and Indians, okay, on the frontier primarily. On this, you see the British troops were in red. They had white bands across their chest. If you were hidden in the woods, like an Indian shooting at them, they had a great, hit me here, right here, and you'll take me out. They were great little, marks. And they walked like that. They were actually walking through the woods 4 abreast on a road that they had cleared. It was ridiculous. They went 2 miles a day. After felling all these trees, they were just creeping along, and the Indians and the French were sitting up in the hills just amazed at the stupidity of the British. And so they're making their way, and you can see on this map, it's hard to, down on the bottom right, Alexandria, Virginia, you see the path that they took westward, and they got to Winchester, Virginia, which is in the Great Valley, the Shenandoah Valley. They crossed there's a long thing. They built this road. They actually built this road through the woods to Fort Necessity, which is a place where Washington's small group of Virginians, of 300 men, had a defeat the year before. Now the British are there, and they're going to save the day with their crack troops from Europe. And Major General Edward Braddock, they're going to kill the French. They're going to wipe out the French and their allies. So they're walking through all the way up where you see that red circle. And you see Fort Duquesne up there. The French were building Fort Duquesne, And this is today's modern Pittsburgh. It's where the Allegheny River from New York comes down, meets the Monongahela from West Virginia, and it makes the Ohio River and flows west toward Louisville. Okay, so the battle was outside of Fort Duquesne. The British never got to the French fort. In fact, they crossed a little creek called Turtle Creek. Half of the column got across the creek, and the French and Indians knew the best time to attack is when you're straddling a creek. Yes. When you've got half your men on one side, half on the other, and that's when they hit them. And battle broke out. This was called the Battle of the Wilderness. Washington later performed the burial service for Braddock, because Braddock was on his horse, perfect shot for the Indians, and there's a picture of him going down there on the extreme right. And the Indians and the French, here's a French guy in the very foreground, working with the Indians, coordinating the attack. You'll see that just to the right of Braddock, there's a officer with his hand up. And I think I've got a little circle that goes on there. Yep. George. Pretty cool what you can do with a PowerPoint, isn't it? Yeah. That's George Washington. So he sees Braddock go down, and he is the next in line. The Major General is down, and now Washington, who's a colonel, again, he's 32 years old, commanding now all of these troops, 1,500 British troops. And he's just trying to fall back through the woods. The Indians fall on them. It's a massacre. In fact, the British lose 2/3 of their army. 2/3. And they're running through the woods. And Washington put the Virginians out as flankers and extended them out away from the road where the British are retreating. Washington put those flankers out and fought hand to hand and slowed the Indians down. Had they not done that, they probably would have lost the entire British command. Okay? So it was the Virginians and hand-to-hand fighting, which Braddock despised. He thought they should be out there in straight lines firing at the enemy in an open field. Problem was there's no open field in the wilderness, and bright red uniforms don't blend in to the green leaves around them. Right? An Indian chief later, this was in 1770, so this is years later, 15 years later, came to Virginia and spoke to General Washington, who was a general at that point. After striving in vain, he said, to hit Washington, we became alarmed. And he told his men to desist from firing at one who was plainly under the care of the great Manitou. Now, the Manitou is the Indian spirit that protects people. So the Great Spirit was protecting Washington, in this opinion of this Indian. So he told his men to stop firing at Washington. You're wasting your bullets, basically. Now, Washington actually was hit 4 times, but the bullets went through his clothing. Not one actually hit his body. And there's a great book that's called The Bulletproof George Washington, even though he was in battle after battle after battle. And this one was the closest combat. He was never actually hit by a bullet. An Indian chief, I guess we just read that, excuse me. He said this, our rifles were leveled, rifles which but for him knew not how to miss. 'Twas all in vain, a power mightier far than we shielded him from harm. He cannot die in battle. I am old and soon shall be gathered to the great council fire of my fathers in the land of shades. But ere I go, there is something bids me speak in the voice of prophecy. And this is what the chief said. Listen, that great spirit protects that man and guides his destiny. He will become the chief of nations, and a people yet unborn will hail him the founder of a mighty empire. Now, some have taken that and said this is the prophecy over George Washington. And I'm not one to really think that this guy was giving him a prophecy from God, but I do believe that this guy was, it's an amazing statement that he makes, because he saw that George Washington was difficult to bring down. Nobody could do it. As I have heard since my arrival at this place a circumstantial account of my death and dying speech, I take this early opportunity of contradicting both and of assuring you that I now exist. And so this was now this was right after the Battle of the Wilderness. There were reports that Washington went down with the dead and wounded, and he'd say, nope, I'm okay. And he wrote a letter, 1755. And I now appear in the land of the living by the miraculous care of providence. Now see what he sees? Not some haughty, prideful guy, I deserve to be saved or something like that from harm. But he says, the gracious hand of providence protected me. So he got this idea, and I think it's accurate, that God was protecting him. That protected me beyond all human expectation, he said. I had 4 bullets through my coat and 2 horses shot under me, and yet I escaped unhurt. So you can today go to Pennsylvania, in the western part of the state. There's a little place called Fort Necessity, and near there's a spot where Braddock was killed during this attack. Washington took over the command, and he had graveside service for Braddock. You can actually stand in the road, and you can see how dense the woods are, and you can stand, and there's the spot where Braddock's body was buried. They rolled over the body with wagons to try to mash and mess up and muddy the whole area, because the Indians would come back and try to dig up the body, and it was considered if you could eat the heart of a defeated general, you took on that guy's power. So they really did a good job disguising where this grave was. And years later, they dug the body up, and they put it on the hill just off, I think, to the west. And there's a monument over it today. So you can see that. I've been there. You can see that today. You can actually see where Braddock went down, and he is now buried. Samuel Davies was a Presbyterian minister. He spoke of that heroic youth, Colonel Washington, whom I cannot but hope Providence has hitherto preserved, in so signal a manner for some important service to his country. So this is the same year this happened, Samuel Davies. So this is how clergymen refer to God. They call God Providence. Okay? Now we don't do that much today, but we talk about God's providence, his protection, his care for his creatures. Now at Valley Forge, we see another great situation where God's protected the American army. And Washington wrote, this is in December of 1777, so the second winter of the war. He said, for the want of shoes, their marches through the frost and snow might be traced by the blood from their feet. And they were almost as often without provisions as with them. So they were starving. He said that the men were literally naked. This is Baron von Steuben, a German, Prussian, I think he was a general.
He's a general, yeah.
General von Steuben. And he came to drill the Americans. He said the men were literally naked, some of them in the fullest extent of the word. Now, something I don't have in here, but Martha Washington came to visit from Virginia, her husband, that winter, and they said that to honor her carriage came into Valley Forge, and they had the men line up on each side of the road. But they had difficulty getting enough men who had enough clothes covering their private areas to actually be able to have her come in a proper way. So it was terrible. It was terrible. It had no clothing, and the clothing was wearing out. And so they were completely almost destitute. Lafayette who was similar. George Washington referred to him as his son, the son of liberty from France, said the army frequently remained whole days without provisions. Many men's feet and legs froze till they became black, and it was often necessary to amputate them. I feel superabundantly, Washington said, for them, and from my soul I pity those miseries which it is neither in my power to relieve or prevent. So this is what the American Army went through. This is the Valley Forge experience. They went into Valley Forge. I've forgotten the figure. I was going to say 12,000. It wasn't that many. I'll have to look that up. I'll remember here in a minute. The blood that stained this ground did not rush forth in the joyous frenzy of the fight. It fell drop by drop from the heart of a suffering people. They who once encamped here in the snow fought not for conquest, not for power, not for glory, not for their country only, not for themselves alone. They served here for posterity. They suffered here for the human race. They bore here the cross of all the peoples. They died here that freedom might be the heritage of all. Beautiful. Very true. Now, Isaac Potts was a Quaker farmer who lived near Valley Forge, and he was a pacifist. Quakers are pacifists. He did not agree with having a war against Great Britain. But one day he saw Washington out in the woods, kneeling and praying. And so this is what he wrote later, having seen this. He says, if there is anyone on this earth whom the Lord will listen to, it is George Washington. And I feel a presentiment that under such a commander, there can be no doubt of our eventually establishing our independence, and that God in his providence has willed it so. Isn't that amazing? Isn't that amazing? What a statement. This was from a guy who did not support the war for independence. He was a pacifist. Answered prayer. There was a miraculous supply of fish that came up the Schuylkill River. It wasn't supposed to come until later in the spring, but right in the depths of their suffering, this big migration of shad come up the river, and Washington's cavalry, they called them dragoons back then, rode into the water, and the men got into the water and actually used shovels and pitchforks and threw the fish over onto the side. There were so many fish in the water. This was a miraculous supply, and it came right at the right moment. Baron von Steuben's training the soldiers. Here was an expert who actually trained them how to fire, reload, retreat, retire, advance. He taught them all the ways of training soldiers, and in the next battle after the winter of Valley Forge, the Americans held their own in the field in a battle against the British. It was the first time the Americans had actually been in the field directly from and they held the British in that battle. Another amazing thing was that France actually came in as our ally. That the French, who hated the British, they wanted to help the Americans, but they just saw, man, these guys are losers. These guys are not going to make it. Look, they can't even field an army. Look at the condition. I mean, they get letters from Lafayette of the condition of the army. And yet, when the Americans won the Battle of Saratoga, France decided to come in. And with that, there was a big infusion of cannon and muskets and food and armaments, and they actually sent 9,000 troops over to help the Americans. And the French Navy came over to blockade the coast, keep the British off the coast. So this was a major thing. Most people today, most historians believe that had France not come in, the Americans would not have won the war. They would not have lasted to win the war. Washington said it, having pleased the almighty ruler of the universe propitiously to defend the cause of the United States, United American States, and finally by raising up a powerful friend among the princes of the earth to establish our liberty and independence upon a lasting foundation, it becomes us to set apart a day for gratefully acknowledging the divine goodness and celebrating the event which we owe to his benign interposition. In other words, God's hand to him is very obvious. Now, at the Battle of Long Island, Washington's men were caught on the western end of Long Island. The British had them surrounded, and for some inexplicable reason, there is no good reason, General Howe, H-O-W-E, stopped his attack and waited till the next day. Well, that night, a fog fell down over the Sound, Long Island Sound, and Washington took his entire army over to Manhattan from Long Island. Every single man got across, no casualties, escaped losing his army, just like that. And a fog came down. It was so thick. In fact, I think I've got a pretty good quote here. You can see here in New York, the British down, and the Americans over here on the far western part of Long Island. They escaped and went to Long Island up there in the, not Long Island, Manhattan, up there in the top of the picture. The British Army was pushing the American Army literally into Long Island Sound, and they surrounded Long Island with their fleet. The British, amazing, when they invade New York, they landed 30,000 men on Long Island. It was 36,000 men. It was the largest number of troops ever to be landed in an expedition like that in modern history. It was huge. So you can imagine the Americans looking at that and seeing that military might coming after them. A scary deal. Now the Americans responded with courage, and they fought the Battle of Long Island but lost it, and they were forced back. And here's Washington directing the evacuation off of Long Island. Kind of a famous picture. As the dawn of the next day approached, those of us who remained in the trenches became very anxious for our own safety. And when the dawn appeared, there were several regiments still on duty. At this time, a very dense fog began to rise out of the ground and off the river. And it seemed to settle in a peculiar manner over both encampments. I recall this peculiar providential occurrence perfectly well, and so very dense was the atmosphere that I could scarcely discern a man at 6 yards distance. So 18 feet away, couldn't hardly see a person, 18 feet. We tarried until the sun rose, but the fog remained as dense as ever. And this is from Major Benjamin Talmadge. How many of you all know usually when the sun comes out, what happens to the fog? The fog lifts or it disperses. Not this fog. This fog stayed in place. Praise the Lord. The Battle of Yorktown, another interesting battle that was amazing. Cornwallis surrendered to Washington. This was the second British surrender, the final surrender. Saratoga, the first, and then this. Resolved, the Continental Congress resolved that Congress will at 2 o'clock this day go in procession to the Dutch Lutheran Church and return thanks to Almighty God for crowning the allied arms of the United States and France with success by the surrender of the Earl of Cornwallis. Now this painting, actually you see in the background, hangs in the Capitol Rotunda. There's 8 big murals. I'd say each mural is about where those crates are, all the way over to the corner, and about that high. So it's a big, big mural. There's 8 of them all the way around in the rotunda. 6 of them show Christian influences. Pocahontas is being baptized in one of them. In another, the Pilgrims had their Bible open on their knee as they were leaving to come to America.